Hello, everybody, and welcome to this mini series that I'm doing on grief and creativity. And today I am joined by Joe Rawlinson. And Joe is a medium, a therapist, and a healer trained in many different modalities. And also, Joe is a bereaved mother and also has a sibling who passed away. So Joe knows grief very intimately. And we're going to talk about your loss today, Joe, but also we're going to talk about the creativity that's come from those losses and your gift actually as a medium. So, first of all, perhaps you could tell the listeners about the experience of losing your brother Glenn and your son Joe, which are obviously two different types of loss, and how they have impacted your life.
Yeah, sure. So my brother Glenn passed in a car accident and he was 19 at the time. So we're going back, just revealing my age, some 40 odd years. And I was 17 at the time. So it was obviously sudden, shocking. And I afterwards discovered that I was having these dreams with Glenn. And we were having these conversations about how I was relating. I was having a difficult time with my father at the time. And he was, Glenn was talking to me about that and we were connecting. And then by chance, so we didn't really have any there was, I mean, there's a sort of mildly Catholic but non-practicing streak, in the family background or let's say way of living. But spirituality wasn't really something that we were involved in. And yet, my dad, by chance, his secretary was going to see the very famous medium Doris Stokes. And many people know about Doris Stokes. She was instrumental, I think, in bringing mediumship to the wider public. And she would I think she filled out the Albert Hall and the Sydney Opera House. She was quite prolific, but she was also, just a very humble, I think she was a dinner lady, but a very humble lady who she was at the local centre and church, and my dad's secretary took him to see her. And she walked onto the platform and she said, "Who's Joe Rawlinson?" Of course, my dad put his hand up and she kind of stopped because it was very soon after it had happened. She realized it was tragic. She didn't want to bring the energy down. But she said to my dad, "Come and see me afterwards." And he did. And she explained, that she had my brother there. She gave his name and some detail. And then she said, "Tell your wife to come and see me." So my mother went for a private reading. And during that reading, Doris Stokes confirmed or validated, let's say, that I was meeting with Glenn and I hadn't told anybody. So she'd said, "Your daughter she has an ability and she's traveling, she's connecting with her brother on the astral plane." So that really opened a door for me. I became very curious, and I guess I'm curious anyway. So, you start to ask some very big questions when something like this happens, and I went looking. So, I was looking into all sorts of things related. I was picking up books on, I suppose this is a few years later, but I was going to the Spiritualist Association of Great Britain, which is in London, and I was going to the Spiritualist Church, and I was then picking up books about hypnotherapy, about subconsciousness, about creativity. And then sort of going into my 20s, I had a bit of an identity crisis. So again, asking those really big questions. What am I doing in life? I think I was working in PR at the time. I was kind of, how does this kind of, what's the meaning here? But I went traveling for a year and I was in India and Thailand and various places, but spent some time meditating with the Buddhist monks in a monastery and stayed on. It was one of the 10-day Vipassana retreats, but I stayed on because I started to understand that it's in the quiet that you make the connection. And I started to just have a sense of how we're all wearing masks in society. We're not the truth of who we are, that actually, what is the personality made of, and all of those sorts of things, and about how we're energetic patterning. And that the patterning is something that we can adjust to when somebody leaves and reconnect with them in a different kind of way. So really that was where Glenn brought me to. Glenn also worked on, this was just before he passed away. He was about 18. He worked on the Voice of Peace in Israel, which is a pirate radio ship, which was set up by Abi Nathan, who was a humanitarian. He's very well known for promoting peace, in that area. And Glenn went and spent, I don't know how many months, 6, 12 months on that ship. And that was all about forgiveness. It was all about bringing people together in unity. And, it was just something that Glenn was forgiveness personified. There was nothing to forgive with him, no matter what had happened. And there was something in the kindness and the forgiveness and the lightness of being with Glenn that was just, I just, came to a point where obviously the grief is a process and I needed to go through that, but it came to a point of realization that he'd opened a door for me and that was something really special. And so then I started to develop more in my mediumship, and I was going to the Arthur Findlay College, I was going to the local spiritualist church, I mean, this is later on, I was at the Arthur Findlay, but that whole, I suppose that whole concept of living from this space and from living peaceably and connecting with something spirit, that we are spirit, we're all spirit. But without his passing, I wonder whether my life would have taken that trajectory. Would I have done all of those things? I became aware of feeling the essence of Glenn. We have a temporary life together, but we can see the benefits of that when somebody has passed. It's as though you don't have that realization until that moment. It gives you that opportunity to feel deeper into that. So I guess, I was grateful for his gift to me in taking me through that transformational process. Um, seeing things more clearly, the truth of the self. And then 10 years later, Joe was born. So 10 years after Glenn's passing, strangely, or perhaps not, his due date was Glenn's passing date, the 15th of August. So he chose his own date to come in. He was his own person. I think it was 4 days later. So he was an only, he's my only son, and I was a single mum from when he was about 18 months. So we had a very close bond. We were really, I would say, on the same frequency. So really like-minded, which is what I'd experienced with Glenn. Of course, the rest of the family, not so much. I was the different one. I was the weird one. And he was very like Glenn, but I was always conscious of not putting that onto him, projecting that onto him so much, and allowing him to be his own person, but very spiritually aware, but in a very grounded and very logical way too, deeply philosophical, just with a clarity. He could really see people, he could see situations very clearly. And I always had this sense with him, and I used to think about it, but then just let it go because that was all I sensed and nothing beyond, that there would be something happening with his brain when he was older. And I just couldn't get any other idea about what that might be. And it's funny that when the soul knows, it's a different way than of receiving and perceiving the information than when it's with your mind. It's just a different, there's more of an, well, there is an acceptance, it just is. So you don't kind of question it in the same way as when you're looking from the mind. So I had these knowing senses, but didn't really question them. And then COVID came, and I wondered if Joe had had COVID because he had a moment where he wasn't well and everybody was isolating. And so, I'd taken things to him, given through the window. And we had these, I don't know, we had this moment. But after that, he was on furlough and we had all these long conversations and all this time together that we spent, much of it in nature, walking, and um, we always had very deep philosophical conversations. And Joe was very interested in my work, and he would ask questions, and he would actually offer information that was helpful, like he really understood it. And throughout his life, like I was conscious of not kind of introducing him at a very, very young age into the work that I was doing, because obviously you need to develop your own grounding and you need to become your own person. And I just felt that perhaps that wasn't appropriate, just as a protective mum, perhaps. But by osmosis, if you're living with somebody that's mediumistic, and he was also naturally very mediumistic. So we would play telepathic games. He would send a message to me when I was out, or can you get me this? And I'd usually come home with it because I'd feel the pull from the solar plexus and sort of almost be like, "Ugh," like why, I'm being pulled to do something, and I'd do it. And he'd say, oh, you got it. And we'd do it, in a playful way. We would do all sorts of exercises and games and things like that. So what we were doing, when I look back now, is developing this really strong telepathy and this way of communing that once he passed, we'd had conversations in that 9 months. We had that very special time. It was like we were outside time, but COVID was weird. I mean, it was kind of like surreal, wasn't it? We all felt as though, and I think that's a trauma response. It doesn't seem real, and I would say that that period of time was like that, where we were sort of starting to come out of COVID, but there was also still this sense of surreal. And I was out walking with Joe. He was talking about going to this other place where, we were outside of time, where the system, it was as though he could see through the whole matrix of life, and he wanted to be somewhere outside of all of that. And of course, my maternal pull, I kind of felt slightly uncomfortable, but I sort of had a sense that it was sacred for him, and what he was sharing with me was not necessarily something that I was to do anything with, but to hold space for. So, he was telling me all these things, and I see now that he was telling me he was preparing to go home. And we had lots of conversations about when you pass to spirit, what the experience is like, things that I've learned from being in connection through my mediumship, um, things that have been replicated in. There's a very good film with Robin Williams. I think it's What Dreams May Come, which is a very good depiction of how it is when you pass into spirit and how you're projecting from your subconscious mind, how that reality is what you meet when you're first there. But we were having all these sorts of conversations, and we were even talking about services and what kind, it was just surreal. But and I was sharing with Joe, we went on this beautiful trip to the New Forest, and I'm a great horse lover. I used to have ponies, and we were sitting by this ford, and these ponies came up, and one of them just leant down and put its muzzle on my heart. For the longest time, we sat there. And there were lots of people on the bank opposite looking over, and Joe said to me, Mom, I said, no, it's fine. And I just have this sense that animals, this was quite soon before he passed, that animals have that sense, don't they? And um, so all of these synchronicities, all these incredible experiences of connectivity and very beautiful things that happened. We had this moment on a bench watching the sunset where I said to Joe, you can come here in your mind, we can reconnect should we get separated in the physical. And also, we were walking in nature where I used to live with my brother, our family home. The river is nearby, and we would go there. Joe actually loved to go there. So we did actually at one time, we went there and we sat on a bench, and the sun was setting in front of us. And I just had this sense of Glenn coming towards us and blending with us. And Joe put his arm around me and we took a photo. And I actually said to him, this feels like heaven. This feels as though Glenn is blending with us. And there was this beautiful connection with Glenn and Joe, because I talked about Glenn quite naturally with Joe and said, you were so alike. you'd have had a lovely time together. And we had this experience where, so the blending, sorry, just go back to that blending experience. So we were sitting on this bench and the sun was setting, and I could feel as if Glenn was coming towards us. And I said to Joe, it's as though Glenn is blending his energy with us, which is what we all do. But this was so soon before he passed that afterwards I recognized that perhaps Glenn was coming to blend to help to bring Joe home. And I know that Joe would recognize Glenn because there's beautiful connection between them. And I would talk about Glenn, and just share synchronicities and things that would happen. And Joe loved all of that, and being a part of that. And when um just a couple of experiences happened. When Joe at one time dropped randomly, he dropped his key to his car down a drain, which was right next to the door. And I was just going out for a walk, and I said to him, "Look, I'll help you when I'm back, but I've told the dog we're going, so just, keep trying." He had his arm on this drain, bless him. And I was in the forest, and I thought I put a call out to Glenn. I said, "Can you help?" There was a little field in the middle of the forest we used to go to, and I used to say to Joe, we call this the field of all possibilities. It was just like this quantum field where you could put out a wish and hand it over to the universe. And so I just put this wish out to Glenn. And while I was in the forest, I just had this moment where I saw him in my mind's eye, like bright as anything. And he just said, "It's fine." And I got back home, Joe answered the door, big smile on his face. And I said, "Did you get it?" And he said, "The weirdest thing happened, Mum." I said, "Go on." And he said, "Well, I went upstairs and I asked Glenn to help. And I went back out again." He said, "I had this incredible uplifting feeling, and I went back out again. And I was just looking at the drain, and a man came by and he said, 'I can help you with that, mate.' And he pulled out this enormous magnetic, what do you call a magnet?
Yeah.
A really big one, though, to pull this. It had to be for the key to come so far up the drain. I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up." And those sorts of things. We were in the south of France once. It was actually the 15th, and I hadn't clocked, this was decades later, and I was with Joe, and we were just driving along, and I suddenly felt the car fill up with so much love. It was tangible. And Joe turned to me and he said, "Glenn's in the car, isn't he, Mum?" And it was on Glenn's passing date. So I hadn't said anything to Joe, but he turned to me and said, "I can feel Glenn in the car." So there was this connection between them. You do have to wonder about aspects of the soul
Yeah.
returning, connecting, guiding. I don't know. Um, but it's definitely the sense of, this connectivity there, all the synchronicities, the coincidences of the timings, the time of Joe's birth, the time of his death, the time of Glenn's death as being the same. Um,
Yeah, it's
very,
really remarkable, what
it
you're
is, isn't it?
describing. Yeah.
Yeah, this
It,
incredible synchronistic connection, which opens up this whole experience of connectivity.
mhm.
Um,
And I
so
know one of your, you know, resounding kind of messages that you've had from Joe since he passed away. Um, and so, yeah, do you want to maybe kind of share a little bit about how he has, his passing has really inspired your creativity?
yeah, so he had a sudden brain bleed. I don't know if I'd said that, but
Mm.
he passed with a sudden brain bleed. And so the thing that I'd seen with his brain actually happened. But the creativity came with just this feeling of wanting to initially document all these incredible synchronicities and just also express what I was feeling, because I wanted to talk to him. I ended up writing. I was writing letters to him, and then I was writing from him to me. And what I found was that when I looked back subsequently later on, that I could pick up one of those journals and open it in a moment where I was experiencing or wrestling with a particular aspect. There's a lot of what ifs, there's a lot of self-blame, there's a lot of guilt, and all those things, that you're wrestling with and going through particularly in the darker earlier days. And there would be an answer to that particular, and it would be from Joe talking to me about his perspective as a soul on that and reminding me to perhaps look at it through another lens, and to understand it in another way. And so that was extremely cathartic. I had experiences like I wrote down, no, one evening I just had this feeling. Again, it's a pull from the solar plexus, but it's so strong that I just followed it. I followed the instinct. I went outside. He said, I just had a feeling of, get a beer from the fridge and go outside. And I'm thinking, why am I doing this? It's midnight. I should be going to sleep. So I went outside and I'm just, sitting on a chair outside. I'm looking up and a star fell down, a falling star right in front of me. And I'd gone back upstairs. I thought, wow, okay, perhaps Joe guided me. But I went upstairs and without really thinking about it, just moved to open the journal. I opened it at a very random page, and there was a message that I'd written from Joe saying, Mum, if I could pluck a star out of the sky for you, I would. And so it became this incredible, I suppose, it was a sacred place where I could share, because you can't, these things are, well, I mean, it's a whole other conversation, I suppose, about how society is with grief and how difficult it is to connect and share your innermost, your deepest, your darkest moments and the emotions. But I think it's being able to express that in a safe place, but also being able to make the connection with Joe through the creative process, being able to um, just have that feedback in the quiet space and being able to have that as a medicine for later on. Um, there were lots of breadcrumbs that he'd left, lots of messages that he'd left, signposts. The painting that he made me of the two hearts with the eyes in, um, the things that he'd sent me about living from the heart space, the videos and things that he'd been exploring and I hadn't actually yet looked into, but randomly or not, was guided to come across somebody that has been has had a lot of learning with indigenous peoples around living from the heart space. They call it the tiny space of the heart, is what the indigenous people do. It's more of a shamanic way of living. But going to those workshops and connecting in a very deep way in my consciousness with Joe, realizing that actually the way in is through the heart. Actually, it's not out there, it's in here, it's all in here. So that's one of the realizations, that the meditations that I was doing with Joe and the things that he'd sent me were replicated in that course. And I hadn't seen them, so I didn't know until afterwards when I watched the things that Joe had sent me, and I was blown away. But we had meditations beforehand, Joe and I, that were synchronistic with what we were doing in that workshop. So I was almost had a crash course before I went from Joe. So it's really about, the seat of the heart being the eye, the eye to see through from, the lens to look through, that we're so much in our minds, we're living, I suppose, industrialization, patriarchal society and all of that, that we're very divided, we're very separated, we're disconnected, we're not. In times gone by, there would have been a different way of living in community and sharing from the heart and experiencing in community the grief. And yet we're all going through this collective grief experience. And, the brain it's not the seat of our consciousness, not the source of our consciousness, just that instrument that interprets it, the information that comes from the physical. But there's a limit to that, to the frequencies. When you're writing, that when you're connecting from that still space, you're feeling it, it's different. It's different to this filtering system, this computer that we have, that we've learned to live by very much in the head, aren't we? So,
Yeah,
um,
very much. It's a really powerful message.
mm, yeah, that we're all in the one, we are. Joe very often said to me, one loves one. He often, just in the sort of gentle way that we interacted, there was this message there, that I don't know, and there was messages that he left in his flat. There were symbols, there were messages about, you know, living from the heart and leaving the mind behind and understanding that we're all one. And it was very meaningful. And then what I began to experience, because I would write something. I remember one bank holiday feeling very alone. Everybody was out with their families. I'm just on my own. I go to the local shop. I've written to Joe that morning, I'm really missing you, really, really missing you today. There's this huge void. It's horrible. I feel so sad and low. And going to the local shop and a little girl coming up to me, would you like this daisy chain? I mean, Joe used to bring me daisy chains, and this little girl just skipped up to me and said, "This is for you." So it's as though those in the spirit world can move through others to connect with us and to bring the love. We're all that love. And that can move through other people, and we can experience it in that way. It's a very moving thing. It's Joe talking to me through someone else. And things like that were happening all the time, which was really lovely. It's about a bit like that story when somebody goes out to buy some sunflowers, they don't really know why, and they put them on a car randomly and they don't really know why. But the person that comes out and receives them, it's their birthday and they've lost somebody that used to give them sunflowers. It's a similar kind of experience, just beautiful, just how we can connect in that way and all
It,
move together, all move in a more harmonious, peaceful, loving way, connected way.
Mhm. And I
Uh,
think it's really easy for us to, to forget that we are connected. And it's so important to have conversations like we're having right now. And for me to remember, for whoever is listening, to
yeah.
remember that we have these angels who are guiding us and supporting us, and we can ask for help and we can ask for
Mm,
signs. And
mm,
you've had these incredible,
mm.
you were telling me just before we started recording that about, do you want to tell the story about the pink feather?
Yeah, so waking up, I think it was the first morning actually after Joe had passed, and just feeling him very much in my heart, feeling and hearing his voice in my heart saying, "You're still in the dream. I've woken up and I'll see you soon." And me saying, "Oh, can you leave me a pink feather as a sign? Is this really, 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 really real?" Because I was very questioning. It does test your faith, even though as a medium, I've been working as a medium for 25 years, but it was a test of my faith. To be perfectly honest, I mean, there was no question after all the things that happened, but in that moment, in the first few days and weeks, yeah. So waking up the next morning to find a pink feather by the bed. And there were all sorts of things, I could ask for, or that he would give me a nudge, or that he would drop into my mind a thought. He would tell me that somebody was going to say something and then they'd say it. He was having fun with all of it. I know he was. He was experimenting. There were things that were happening. He changed the picture of him on my phone overnight, and I'd wake up, there'd be a different picture there, or yeah, just incredible, just beautiful. I came to realize, I'd be driving along and I'd play I Spy and he'd tell me what color car was going to come around the corner, or know what I could see up ahead. And they're mundane things, and this is the thing, they're not, I do believe that then they're not here. They may guide us and put ideas and thoughts into our mind and help us in ways, and yet they're not here to tell us what to do or, to prescribe life for us, because that's kind of where takes away the purpose and the point of us being here, to go through the experiences to learn from.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, I what I came to think was that, wouldn't it be lovely for people to have a journal like that they could write in, that they could have prompts, they could have some of the wisdoms that came from Joe have been so profound. I've been having this daily chat with him for 3.5 years now, and from him in his energetic form, and it just, I think, would be beautiful as a sacred space, to actually put down those emotions, to actually, when you with the emotions, when you allow them, when you welcome all the grief, and you put it there, you express it, you release it, that then takes away some of the blocks that allow you to change your frequency, to begin to adjust to the connection that is always there with your loved one, and that in doing that also prompts for writing to and from your loved one, or exercises to help with that you can continue your conversation, you can continue your relationship. It's just changing the pattern, it's just making that adjustment. And that's not, I think you can use spirituality to bypass, and it's absolutely not about that, because there is a purpose for grief. There absolutely is a purpose for it. And so it's to honor that, and while also honoring your continued relationship. So that really is what that's led me to. The other thing is a book that's a memoir. Have I? I don't
Yeah,
know
no,
if I've
you
already.
haven't shared about that. Yeah.
But the other project is a memoir, which is really about the connectivity. How we're all so interconnected, how Glenn and Joe, through that interconnection, but also through really the depth that Joe's passing has helped me understand, the depth of experience of unity, of interconnected, of how, we are so much a part of this moving tapestry of life. The threads are so interwoven, and how when we're just with our feelings, when we allow them, when we don't try and change them, but we're just, he left lots of messages about just be you and be true to you. And when you're totally with yourself, something really beautiful happens. It's like that practice and the art of being with yourself again and again and again. Grief is a baseline emotion for everyone on the planet. We're all, from the moment of separation from the womb, it's the original stone cast, isn't it? It's all human behavior on the emotional scale is that expression of that grief process, that when we're separated from others, we feel like we've lost them. Even our language is couched around, we've lost them, but grief is, for me, what happened with Joe is like a deeper experience, the reflection of that separation from birth, from our true essence that we're all trying to get back to. We're all trying to come home again to ourselves. And grief is that sort of process within us all where we've lost that, we've lost ourselves. It's almost like we need to be reborn in that way. And this period of time, it's all about, the consciousness that we are in that is rising, that there's more awakening into that. There's more sense of, all the underbelly and all the shadow and that's all coming up to the surface. But it's really about kind of freeing ourselves and grieving for the loss of ourselves, but vowing not to leave ourselves again, by not expecting ourselves to be different or to be masked, or, to be playing out something that's not truly who we are. So there's something there that kind of, I felt as though by writing about the story of Joe and the connection with Glenn and what Joe has shown me through this process and this period of time, is kind of Joe's message to the world, to remember who we truly are. And so, the working title is Remember. And it really is about all those incredible synchronicities that show that the soul is outside time. We have this linear time that we live by, but actually, from a soul perspective, and if we can live through the heart and through the soul perspective, we come to understand, there's so much more. There is so much more that we're a part of. And it's really about coming home to yourself, understanding the truth of your being. And if the world, if everybody in it lived in that way, what a different place it would be. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think, it's I love everything that you're sharing, and and you're also your honesty of like when Joe first passed away, and you also had your your faith really tested.
I really did. Yeah.
Yeah, and that, we are human and we are on this human plane, and we can have
Yeah.
deeper awareness about spirit, and we're always in this conflict, aren't we? It's like there's no such thing as time, but we are in t
Yeah.
a place of time, and
Yeah. That's
it's
right.
hard to have patience. And um, but in your
Mm,
experience, for example, if I found it very, very helpful to have a reading with with a medium, and it took me
mm,
many years to really pluck up the courage to do that. And I would be just interested for you to share with the listeners, how, because it's like, look, it's not here to take away all the pain, but it somehow, helps a lot, doesn't it? So I'd love to hear, how you feel that it can help facilitate the grieving process.
mm. A reading, I feel a reading needs to give you validation that your loved one is living on energetically. So that life continues beyond the physical. And they've not left you, they're just in another frequency that you can't actually experience. Well, you can because we're all soul, so we can experience it. It's just that, when we're in a grief process, particularly, the frequency is such that, we're not, it's much more turbulent and we're not in, it's a much, much higher vibration. So a good reading would actually be evidential enough that it would take you beyond any doubt. So, we've all had there's all kinds of readings, and a brilliant medium can have an off day. And in that case, you would, well, certainly for me, if were that to happen, it actually hasn't, but I will always say to whoever comes to me, if I'm not connecting, if something's not quite right, if we're not aligned, if in the first 10 minutes, you can't understand what I'm saying to you, it's not evidential enough, then we reschedule or it's money back. Because it needs to be what I call the golden nuggets, but it needs to be so evidential that it takes you beyond that doubt. Not, I wouldn't, if you leave and you say, well, maybe I'm not sure if that was my person, that's not, for me, that's not good enough. So I would expect, and I would also set that intention with the spirit world, that together we would bring the information, small details, maybe sometimes seemingly mundane details. And there's something in that, I would say, as well, about being, when people are really honed in on wanting a specific message. I would say don't do that, because you kind of energetically you're closing things down. So if you can stay open and think bigger picture and be open to what comes, then it's going to be better, because I might not necessarily be able to sense that particular piece of information in that moment, because it's a frequency and I have to line up with that frequency in order to bring that information. However, it's extremely healing and comforting to know that, or to have that sense of they are around me, they can see what I'm doing. So they might talk about, so I would bring some information so that that that's your person. So this is, I have mum here, she's passed with this condition, or she's telling me that she used to love these things and this is her personality. She's making me feel that this is how she would be. And I know that she, those sorts of things. So you start to become aware that it's your person. And then also then they will very often say, I've had experiences where somebody has said, given me a song, dropped a song into my mind, and I will share that song with the my readie, and they'll say, "Oh my God, that song was in my mind on the way here," or "That's our song." That's my song that connects me with her. So those sorts of pieces but also then I had somebody the other day say, you were looking at a photograph of me and talking about me, and you did this. And they were all gathered around the photograph. They were talking about him and his life. And that's just a beautiful validation. I'm here with you. I know what's happening in your life. I see that you're waking up at 5 a.m. every morning. I'm with you. um, Perhaps things, where they will just confirm something that you've been worrying about. I've had that also. I know that you've been worrying about what you're going to do about this situation, or that I see that a new baby's been born and I've been around. It's all those sorts of things that really will validate that they're still around with you and living life with you. Also, there's something about what I'm experiencing when I'm working in a shamanic way that often a loved one will come and we'll talk about a pattern that's been handed down through generations. It might be a grandmother, or, if it's appropriate, say a mother come in and say, well, I understand that this happened to me, and I see that for you, you're living in this way, or that this is why you're having this experience. And that's also very helpful in the healing sense, and also a conversation about the relationship. It might be where somebody will come back and apologize for having been a certain way, and to say, well, now I see the bigger picture and I can share with you, I understand how I was. That was a blind spot for me. And I realize now, because I'm reviewing my life spirit side, the impact that had on you. So, lots of ways in which it's extremely, I feel, comforting, and can bring a healing element in, that is, it's uplifting. Yeah. It can be very emotional, which is also when you're really connecting in with the heart. So, yeah.
Yeah, and another way to maybe, yeah, for some people they need to unblock that part and have
Yes,
peace.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
And that it's so interesting that it was your brother Glenn that really opened that for you.
Yeah. I'm so grateful to him.
Yeah, and that if maybe, like you said, if that hadn't have happened, your life would have been very different, possibly.
Yeah, I don't know. I suspect so, because I wouldn't, it's when you have an experience like that that you start to seek or reach out or wonder, that you have the big questions come, you have the questioning about who am I, what's my purpose, what's it all about. So
Mhm.
mm,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, you really do. And I do think that's something that's so profound about grief, particularly when grief from when somebody dies, because I'm always amazed that people don't think about those questions all the time. But
Yeah, me too. And asking them from a very young age. But yeah,
yeah,
yeah, I know.
because that, a lot of people that I work with, it does set them off on this path of seeking, as you said, and and there's just, it opens up your whole mind to
It
some things
does.
that you never ever thought about before.
It does, yeah. I mean, your heart is shattered. You have a loss, but as Rumi said, the wound is where the light comes in. So it's that opening up that seems to then offer the opportunity, or the portal, let's say, for the connectivity. You know, so much in society takes you away from who you are. It's when you're met with silence in the darkest hour of need, that spirituality or reaching out or reaching within, it's that way of discovery. It's just because it just comes in that moment, doesn't it? As you reach out from that place. But also, we are spiritual beings. We do walk in two worlds at once. I believe everybody is mediumistic because we're all souls
Yeah.
and we can all go into the quiet. I just feel that we've sort of had that power kind of taken away from us over the years and years of indoctrination, that we're not powerful in that way, that we're not able to connect in that way. What I was going to say, you were talking about, you were just talking then about, what were you saying about emotion or about grief taking you into? I believe that grief opens up other wounds. When you have one heartbreak, all the other losses sit up in your heart, and it just is that opportunity then to really feel into who you are, and also the patterns, that you're living out that aren't, it just takes you into yourself, doesn't it, in that way that there is an opportunity there.
Yeah. And as you
Yeah.
said, you can feel so, nobody likes the feeling of grief. And we worry so much about how long it's going to last and how long am I going to feel like this.
Mm,
And yet there's so much discovery that
yeah,
can happen. There's so much awakening that
yeah,
can happen. There's so many new
yeah.
connections you might find.
I think
And
it's an opportunity.
like,
Sorry.
well, no, no,
Mm,
no, it's fine. But, a lot can happen in the discomfort.
absolutely. That's where the medicine is, isn't it? I think in the discomfort, it's there's also the love. You talked about the dualistic experience, the kind of, we're in this polarity, if you like, duality. I found grief very polarizing, but I think the learning is in holding both, in understanding that in the grief there's also an experience of joy, and also that when you're journeying beyond that powerlessness and shock, you can go across that bridge that gaps you, that is over the gap, from into the higher vibrational states. It seems to, because of this duality, it seems to, like it's like almost the prison that sets me free. And that once you are able or willing to be with it, to truly surrender into it, that you start to experience that. And it's very interesting journey. It really is. But I suppose our conditioning is to move away from it, is to suppress, deny, to just carry on, Carruthers, and put the mask onto the world. I'm okay. We don't want other people, we don't want to express our vulnerability. I mean, obviously there's a time and a place, granted, but the more that we can, I suppose, be with that vulnerability ourselves and face the grief and be with those uncomfortable feelings, the more that we discover that the gift they have to show us. Yeah, absolutely. um yeah, it's a wild ride.
It's a wild ride, and you have so much wisdom to share, Joe.
Thank you.
So it's been, yeah, it's what you have a really lovely voice, so I can see how you do hypnotherapy. Um, and obviously writing has just been such a medicine for you, and what you're creating with your journal, which is going to help other people to also use writing as a medicine and give them inspiration. And then your memoir also is going to really help a lot of people and share this message of, this is the time that we're in.
Mm.
This is the age of Aquarius. Like, we need to live from our hearts, not so much in our heads. And that's a challenge in the world that we live in right
Yeah,
now. So it's a very
yeah.
important message that you are sharing with the world. And I can't wait to listen to your book or read your book when it's out, and we'll keep in touch. And I know that um, I invited you to tea with Tara, so we have to talk about that as
Oh,
well.
yeah, that'd be lovely. Yeah.
Yeah. But is there anything else that you want to share before we wrap up the interview?
Hmm. What do I want to say? Let me think. Just, I suppose that we, my greatest wish is that, the journal, the mediumship, the the memoir, that it's just a sacred place. It can hold and help in a time of grief. But I would, I just want to say that um there is a gift within grief. There is a beautiful saying. I think it's Rumi. Forgive me if I've got that wrong, but it's a step towards your own heart. So a step towards your own heart is a step towards the beloved. And in this house of mirrors, you see a lot of things, but rub your eyes because only you exist. And goodbyes are for those who love with their eyes, because when you love with your heart and soul, there's no such thing as separation. It's all an illusion.
That is beautiful.
Mm.
Yeah.
I like to take inspiration from the greats,
Ah,
Rumi and the Sufis, and those, because that's what their understanding was, of just living from the heart space, and it's so much needed in this time. And also the challenge is also the opportunity. That's
mm,
the thing. It's just looking through the lens to see it that way. That's a choice we all have.
mhm,
I think initially you live with hope. It was hope that sustained me initially when I was really in the dark with, why has this happened? I'm already working with spirit. I'm already doing this work. How can this happen? It's like snakes and ladders. I've come back down to, I don't know anything. But actually, surrendering into, I don't know anything is a powerful place ultimately. I don't know if powerful is the right word. Um, I'm starting to see now that there is a real value in it.
yeah.
Yeah.
And we're
And
always
that's
learning.
always,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah, for sure. It's very humbling, isn't it?
it is.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, it's been really lovely to meet you, Joe, and thank you for
And you.
everything that you've shared. And thank you if you've been listening. And yeah, look forward to hearing more about all your endeavors.
Oh, thank you, Tara. Thanks for your time. It's been lovely to share with you this time.
Bye, everybody.